Aaliyah Grant was 3 hours into a 14-hour flight from Seoul to Chicago when the call light over 2A started blinking in the fast, uneven pattern that meant something was actually wrong. She found Park Jun-soo. She didn't know his name yet, just his seat number and his usual quiet politeness, with both hands at his throat, hives already climbing his neck, his breathing turning into short, wet gasps. 9 years of yearly recertifications kicked in before conscious thought caught up. She got on the interphone, called it in as a probable anaphylactic reaction, and had a colleague patch the cockpit through to the airline's ground-based flight surgeon service while she pulled the emergency kit and worked through the protocol out loud, partly for him and partly to keep her own hands steady. "Any known allergies?" she asked, already guessing. "Shellfish," he managed, voice thinning. "It's on my file. I didn't order." "I believe you." The ground physician confirmed anaphylaxis over the radio, based on her report, and authorized the epinephrine in the kit. Aaliyah administered it exactly the way she'd trained for, timed his breathing, and kept talking to him in a low, even voice until the swelling started to ease and color came back into his face. The captain diverted to Anchorage as a precaution, standard procedure for anything this serious over the Pacific. By the time paramedics met them on the tarmac, Jun-soo was stable, mortified, and thanking a woman whose name he still didn't know. Before we continue, if heartfelt cinematic stories like this are your kind of escape, hit like and subscribe. You won't want to miss where this journey leads. Aaliyah figured that was the whole story, an unusual entry in her incident log, a commendation letter, maybe a good tip. Instead, 3 weeks later, her airline's crew office forwarded a request from Park Shipping Group's private aviation division. They flew Jun-soo, the heir to the family's logistics conglomerate, on a dedicated aircraft for most of his international travel, and they were staffing up the permanent cabin crew. Her incident report had been flagged during the review process. The interview wasn't a fairy tale sweep her off her feet moment. It was a conference room at the private terminal, 2 other candidates in the waiting area she recognized from other charter operations, and an HR director named Cho Yun-hee, who spent 40 minutes going through Aaliyah's medical certifications, her Korean and Mandarin proficiency, her 9 years of long-haul seniority, and her references before Jun-soo ever entered the room. "Your incident response was a factor in why we reached out," Director Cho told her plainly. "But the position requires the same qualifications regardless of who requests it. We're not in the habit of putting unqualified crew on an aircraft carrying our principal passengers." Jun-soo joined only for the last 15 minutes, a little sheepish, mostly there to answer her questions about the route schedule. "For what it's worth," he added as the interview wrapped, "I did ask that you be considered. I'd rather fly with someone who's already proven she knows exactly what to do if something goes wrong. But Director Cho would have turned me down flat if you weren't the strongest candidate on paper too." "There've been other incidents?" Aaliyah asked, because something in how carefully he'd said it caught her attention. "One, about 14 months ago. Genuinely accidental. As far as anyone could tell, mislabeled ingredients at a hotel in Singapore. This is the first one since." He said it lightly, but she filed it away anyway, the way she filed away most things that didn't quite add up. She signed a standard contract 2 weeks later, better pay than her airline job, a predictable schedule, full benefits, a clear organizational chart that put her under Director Cho's operations office for all scheduling and personnel matters, not under Jun-soo directly, a detail Aaliyah noted with some relief before she'd even thought to ask about it. The private schedule became its own kind of routine: long-haul business trips across Asia and North America, hotel conference rooms instead of tourist neighborhoods, Jun-soo working through cargo manifests at 35,000 feet, while Aaliyah ran the cabin and, as part of the job now, personally verified every catering delivery against his allergy protocol before it ever reached his tray. It wasn't dramatic work, it was careful and repetitive, and somewhere in months of it, careful and professional slowly started keeping company with something else. About 6 weeks in, on a routine leg out of Incheon, The routine cracked just enough to remind her why the job mattered. The tamper seal on Junso's tray was already broken when she checked it, and the manifest number stapled to the box didn't match the supplier code on file for that route. She didn't ask questions. She pulled the tray, logged it, and had the ground crew hold departure 11 minutes while a replacement cleared from an approved kitchen instead. The vendor's account team apologized within the hour, blamed a warehouse mix-up during a shift change, and comped the contract fee for the trip as a goodwill gesture. Junso thanked her for being careful and didn't think about it again. Neither, at the time, did she. Just one more entry in a logbook full of ordinary caution, filed and forgotten. She learned, in scraps between meetings, that he'd spent 2 years quietly trying to build a disaster relief shipping partnership using a slice of the family's cargo capacity. Thin margin, unglamorous work, his father dismissed as a distraction from the actual business. "He keeps telling me it doesn't pencil out," Junso admitted one night over reheated hotel food in Tokyo, sleeves rolled up, contracts spread across the table. "I keep telling him it doesn't have to replace the business, it just has to matter too." "It matters," Aaliyah said. "I've worked flights carrying that kind of cargo before. 48 hours can be the difference between supplies arriving during the emergency or after everyone's already given up on help showing up." He looked at her like she'd handed him something he badly needed to hear from someone who wasn't trying to sell him anything. She met Han Yura, Junso's fiancée, properly for the first time about 2 months into the contract. At a family dinner, Junso had warned her would be a lot. Yura turned out to be nothing like the polished cutout Aaliyah had braced for. She arrived late, apologizing with real embarrassment, for a meeting that had run long, kicked off her heels under the table the second Junso's father looked away, and spent 20 straight minutes charming his notoriously difficult grandmother into laughing at something on her phone. She sought Aaliyah out before dessert, taking both her hands like she meant it. "I've wanted to say this properly for months," Yura said. "You saved his life on a random Tuesday, and then just went back to your job like it was nothing. That's not nothing. Thank you." She held on a beat longer than the moment quite needed, head tilting slightly. "Do you check every meal yourself? Every single time, no matter how small the risk seems?" When Aaliyah said yes, always. Yura's smile didn't move, but something behind it seemed to note the answer down before she laughed and let go of her hands. "I'm so glad he finally has someone that careful around him." It was warm enough, specific enough, that Aaliyah filed it away as exactly what it appeared to be, a genuinely relieved woman, grateful to a stranger. The second time stuck with her even more. At a different dinner, Junso's father dismissed the relief shipping proposal outright, the way he usually did, and it was Yura, not Aaliyah, who pushed back first, laying out, with real fluency, why the margins made more long-term sense than he wanted to admit. Why the goodwill alone would outlast a bad fiscal quarter. Junso caught Aaliyah's eye across the table afterward, something like relief and pride tangled together on his face. "She does that," he said quietly, once his father had moved on to another topic. "Fights for the parts of me nobody else bothers to notice." Aaliyah had no reason that night to doubt a word of it. None of that softened what she'd started to sense underneath the warmth, though. The engagement itself had become more obligation than relationship months earlier, by Junso's own quiet admission, somewhere over the Pacific, postponed twice already, pushed back again, each time family politics found a new excuse to delay the date. Yura could still be genuinely kind, genuinely invested in his family, and still be someone he no longer expected to marry with any real conviction. Both things were apparently true at once, which made the whole situation harder to name, not easier. It was around then that Aaliyah noticed Junso pulling back in small, deliberate ways that told her more than anything he actually said out loud, starting a message to her late one night in a Tokyo hotel, and then she caught a glimpse of it the next morning, deleting the whole thread before it ever sent, choosing the seat across the aisle instead of beside her at a crew breakfast, for a reason neither of them mentioned. She recognized the pattern because she was quietly doing the same thing herself. It was somewhere around month 3, after one too many of those late nights that had started lasting longer than the work required, that Aaliyah made herself say the thing she'd been avoiding. "I need to say something, and I need you to actually hear it," she told him, in the empty galley after a red-eye, both of them running on too little sleep. "You're the reason I have this job. Your family pays my salary. Whatever's happening between us right now, it's happening inside a situation where you have real power over my career, whether you mean to use it or not. I'm not comfortable pretending that's not true." He didn't argue with her, which she appreciated more than she expected to. "You're right," he said, after a long moment. "What do you want to do about it?" "I want it on record, formally, that Director Cho handles every part of my contract without your input, starting now, not just on paper, but for real, including renewals," Aaliyah said. "And I want us to actually wait, not pretend the wait isn't happening, just wait, until this isn't a situation where anyone could reasonably say I got something because of what's between us, instead of because I earned it." "Okay," he said simply. "I'll talk to Director Cho tomorrow." He did, and from then on, every scheduling and compensation decision affecting her ran through Cho's office, documented, with Jun So formally recused. It didn't change what he still was to the company. It just closed the gap that had actually been bothering her, and for the first time, Aaliyah let herself stop rehearsing reasons to be careful. It was a few weeks after that conversation, cross-checking an upcoming catering order out of habit, that she noticed something that had nothing to do with any of it. As Executive Vice President overseeing corporate services, Yura's office also supervised executive travel, events, and VIP catering contracts, a broad enough portfolio that nobody had ever questioned it. The vendor contracted for this month's route, the one responsible for the meal that had nearly closed Junso's airway over the Pacific, had been selected personally, and unusually directly, by that same office, well below the level of decision Yura herself would normally have bothered with. The change had gone through a special override she'd signed off on personally, citing the sensitivity of executive travel, the kind of shortcut nobody questioned at the time, and the exact shortcut that would later make her the only person who could have quietly swapped one supplier for another without anyone noticing. If you're already picking sides in this one, drop a comment and tell us who you think is really behind it. And if you haven't hit subscribe yet, now's the time, because what's coming is a lot more personal than a boardroom vote. Aaliyah sat with it for 4 days before she did anything at all. She kept rereading her own notes on layovers, trying to talk herself out of what they seemed to show. One vendor, one office, one uncomfortable coincidence that could just as easily be nothing. It was on the 3rd night that she thought to go back through her old incident log and found the broken seal from months earlier, the one she'd logged and forgotten, the one the vendor had explained away as a warehouse mix-up. Same vendor, same supplier code that hadn't matched the manifest. She'd filed it as caution rewarded, not as a first attempt that simply hadn't worked. Now she couldn't unsee it as possibly both. Yura had held her hands over dinner and thanked her like she meant it. Yura had fought for Junso's relief shipping proposal in front of his own father, which was exactly why this felt impossible. It felt absurd, almost ungrateful, to look at that same woman and wonder if she'd had anything to do with a reaction that had nearly closed Junso's airway. More than once, Aaliyah closed the Notes app on her phone and told herself she was pattern matching out of nerves, the same instinct that made her double-check locked doors twice. She almost didn't say anything to anyone. What finally moved her wasn't certainty. It was the thought of staying quiet and being wrong about that later, when it would matter more than her own discomfort did now. When she finally worked up the nerve to tell Jun So what she'd noticed, the words came out smaller than she meant them to. "What if I'm wrong?" she asked, sitting across from him in the cramped office he used for cargo planning. "What if I take this to compliance and it's nothing, and I've just destroyed a woman's reputation over a coincidence?" He didn't rush to tell her she was right, which she noticed, and was grateful for. "Then we'll find that out honestly," he said instead. "Together, that's the whole point of doing this the slow way instead of the easy way." It wasn't reassurance exactly. It was something steadier than that, and it was enough to send her to Director Cho's office the next morning instead of sitting on it any longer. But she kept the actual paperwork strictly to Cho's office. Whatever she'd already told Jun-so the night before as a friend, the formal report needed to go through the same recused channel they'd agreed on months earlier, not through him directly. The same instinct that had made her insist on the reporting line change in the first place. Cho looped in the company's compliance officer, Jung Hae-won, a methodical woman who, as it turned out, had already been quietly reviewing an unrelated billing irregularity tied to that same vendor for weeks. Once the two sets of findings were laid side by side, the picture that emerged was smaller and more precise than a pattern of repeated attacks, and, Hae-won said carefully, considerably more legally serious for exactly that reason. There had only ever been one incident anyone could actually prove. This one. The earlier Singapore reaction really had been an accident, unconnected to anyone. The broken seal months later was different. Hae-won flagged it the moment Aaliyah mentioned it, but the vendor's paper trail on the warehouse mix-up held up cleanly enough that it would never survive a courtroom, and everyone in the room understood exactly what that likely meant, without anyone saying it out loud. Hae-won couldn't prove the broken seal incident had been deliberate, but neither could she comfortably dismiss it anymore. The version that finally worked was bolder than a first attempt would need to be, if there'd been one. Whatever had actually happened with that broken seal, it had planted a useful idea in Yura's mind, that Jun-so's allergy, and the fact that it had already generated one uncomfortable incident on record, could be leveraged. Park Shipping's board was weeks away from a closely contested vote on a proposal to split the roles of chairman and CEO, a vote expected to come down to a handful of undecided family shareholders. A second, more dramatic incident, timed right, wouldn't need to trigger any formal medical clause to do damage. It just needed to feed a quiet, ongoing narrative that Jun-so was accident-prone, unreliable, poorly supported by his own staff, exactly the kind of doubt that could tip a few nervous swing votes toward Yura's cousin Yong-jae, who was positioning himself as the safer, steadier choice. It was Jun-so, not Hae-won's team, who closed the last real gap in the case. When Aaliyah walked him through what compliance had found so far, the vendor, the timing, the swing vote, he went quiet for a long moment, then pulled up an old email on his phone. "This name," he said, turning the screen toward her, tapping the vendor's registration number. "I've seen it before. Months ago, Yong-jae asked me to sign off on a routine shipping manifest correction for his division. I barely looked at it. It seemed like nothing. But this registration number was on it." He looked almost sick realizing what he was holding. It wasn't just Yura's office using this vendor. Yong-jae's division was already routing cargo through the same shell company before any of this happened. "I have the email that proves it. That single thread, a distracted, half-read approval from months earlier, was what let Hae-won's team finally connect Yura's catering contract to Yong-jae's freight division with something more solid than coincidence, turning two separate suspicions into one coordinated case. "I want to be very clear with both of you about something," Hae-won said, once she'd confirmed what Jun-so's email actually showed and briefed Aaliyah and Jun-so together. What Yura did wasn't a calculated, low-risk maneuver. Deliberately exposing someone to a known severe allergen on a trans-Pacific flight is genuinely dangerous. There was no guarantee the reaction would stay survivable, and I don't think she fully reckoned with that when she arranged it. That recklessness is exactly why the charges we're recommending go well beyond corporate misconduct. This is reckless endangerment territory. On top of the vendor fraud. Jun-so went very still hearing that. "She gambled with my life to win a boardroom vote," he said slowly. "Not because she wanted me dead, because she genuinely didn't think it through carefully enough to realize how close it actually came." He exhaled, something in his face closing over. "Somehow that's worse." "You're allowed to feel however you actually feel about it," Aaliyah said, sitting close enough that their shoulders touched, the two of them no longer needing to police the space between them, the way they had for months. He looked over at her, exhausted and open in a way she'd rarely seen. "I mean it," she added, Both of us have spent weeks being careful about this. You don't have to be careful about how angry you're allowed to be." He reached for her hand, and this time neither of them treated it like something that needed a formal conversation first. It simply felt earned. They didn't try to handle what came next alone. Haewon's team spent the following month building an actual case, vendor contracts, internal communications, a timeline solid enough to survive outside legal scrutiny, instead of just an emotional confrontation. The plan for the shareholder meeting, where the chairman-CEO split would finally be voted on, was deliberately unglamorous. Legal counsel would present the compliance findings to the full board and the voting shareholders before any ballots were collected, giving everyone in the room the full picture before they cast a vote that had, until now, been quietly shaped by a narrative nobody had known was manufactured. "My father's going to be in that room," Junso said the night before, quieter than Aaliyah had heard him in months. "This becomes permanent and public the second it's on the record, in front of the full shareholder base." "It's already real," Aaliyah said. "This just makes sure the people voting actually know what they're voting on." The shareholder meeting was about as far from cinematic as a confrontation could get. A long conference table, 30-some family shareholders and their proxies, legal counsel walking through weeks of vendor records and internal messages, while Yura's composure slowly, visibly cracked under the weight of a timeline she clearly hadn't expected to see laid out this precisely, this early, in front of exactly the people whose votes she'd been trying to influence. There was no chase, no dramatic exit. Junso's father sat through the entire presentation in stony silence, and at the end of it, simply asked the board's outside counsel to formally note that Yura's and Yongjae's proxies would be excluded from the vote, pending the ongoing investigation. "I should have caught this months ago," he said afterward, to no one in particular. "I was so focused on the numbers, I let someone else write the story about my own son's reliability, without ever checking whether it was true." On her way out, flanked by two of the board's security staff, Yura stopped just long enough to find Aaliyah across the hallway. Whatever composure she had left, she spent all of it on one quiet sentence. "You should have stayed a flight attendant." "I did," Aaliyah said, and kept walking. Afterward, once the room had emptied, Junso found Aaliyah still gathering her notes near the back. "It's not fully over," he said. "There's a legal process now. Criminal charges, not just a boardroom finding. It could take a long time." "I know," Aaliyah said, "but you don't have to sit across from her at dinner anymore, wondering. That part's done." Small mercies. He managed a tired, real smile. "So, what now, officially, on the record, with Director Cho's full knowledge?" "Now," Aaliyah said, laughing despite herself, "I finish out my contract like a normal employee, and you finish building that relief shipping division your father's finally going to have to take seriously. And somewhere in there, we figure out what we actually want, now that neither of us has to pretend we're not figuring it out." 7 months later, Aaliyah stood on the tarmac watching the Relief Aviation Division's first dedicated cargo flight take off toward a flood-affected region in the Philippines, a project whose crew safety protocols she'd helped design after formally transferring, at her own request, into a new role overseeing aviation safety for the division, reporting to Director Cho and nobody else. The criminal case against Yura and Yongjae was still moving through the courts, slower than anyone wanted but moving all the same, the reckless endangerment charges very much still on the table. Junso's father had become, grudgingly, and then not so grudgingly, one of the relief division's loudest internal advocates. "You know," Junso said, coming up beside her as the plane climbed out of sight, "you saved my life on a random Tuesday flight to Chicago, and neither of us had any idea what we were actually starting." "I was just doing my job," Aaliyah said. "The rest of it, we actually had to work out on purpose, one uncomfortable conversation at a time." "Fair," he said, nudging her shoulder. "I think that's probably why it stuck." Outside, Seoul's evening traffic moved the way it always had, and somewhere over the Pacific, a cargo plane was carrying supplies toward people who needed them because one stubborn man had refused to let profit be the only thing that counted, and one careful woman had refused to let anything about their relationship happen the easy, unexamined way. It wasn't the fastest route to each other. It was, both of them agreed, the one that actually held up. If this story moved you, drop a comment and let us know where in the world you're watching from. And if you haven't already, hit subscribe for more heartfelt, cinematic stories like this one every week. Until next time, stay steady, stay soft-hearted, and keep watching.